Hello, everyone. I see that it's the top of the hour, 7 o'clock. Hi, my name is Agnes. Welcome to the Natural Areas Management Services webinar series. Hopefully you were able to join us last week. If you weren't able to join us last week, the website will come up where you can see last week's recording. So welcome to learning more about how to expand the services you offer to your clientele. This series is brought to you by a collaboration of a few states, the University of Maryland Extension, the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Penn State Extension, and the Virginia Department of Forestry. This builds the Woods in Your Backyard Partnership. This is their second collaboration. And I'm pleased to say that the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology helped us to finance this. We got a grant, and we're very excited and proud about that. This Woodlands Practices Handbook and Checklist was born from the Woods in Your Backyard program for landowners. That's a very successful education program for landowners. Educating landowners about their property and services they can do on their property and enhance their woodlands. What was found out over these years of offering this program was who's there to provide the services. So what the Woods in Your Backyard Partnership decided to do was to create a manual and checklist for the service providers to help small landowners of about 10 acres or less. So this is the second of the 4-part series, Land Care Practices for Woodland Health. We're going to be covering chapters 4 and part of chapters 1 and 2. It's going to be an overview of woodland ecology and principles of succession. Understanding woodland ecology is essential to understanding why and how land care practices are applied and the results that can be expected. This session will also introduce land care practices, including converting lawns to natural areas, along with managing riparian buffers, modifying and/or improving wildlife habitat, and chosen tree management. Before we move forward on that, I'd like to go through a little bit of housekeeping. Hi. As I introduced myself already, my name is Agnes Kedmanitz. I'm with the University of Maryland Extension. I'm the Woodland Stewardship Educator. I coordinate the Maryland-Delaware Master Logger Program, as well as contributing to the Woodland Stewardship Education Program for landowners. Andrew Kling, he hosted last week, and now he's in the back of the house today. He's also with the University of Maryland Forestry Extension team. One of the things he does is the Woods in Your Backyard program for landowners. If you're interested in that, please, you can check out our website and find out more. So we thank you for registering today and for this series. So some of the benefits of registering is this learning opportunity, a great way to make connections, meet professionals, and find out a little bit more about some things. This webinar is being recorded. By you being with us for this webinar is permission that you are okay with it being recorded. As you may have noticed, all participants are muted and video is off. This works really well to maintain good bandwidth so that we can ensure that we have a good connection for all. As I mentioned before, the webinar 1 is located at extension.umd.edu/woodland. That's where all the recordings can be found. By the end of the 4 sessions, they will be there. So to acquire continuing education credits, as you may already realize, International Society of Arboriculture, Maryland-Delaware Master Logger Program, Society of American Foresters, many other continuing education credits are available. To do this, there is going to be a link sent to you in the chat box. So are you familiar with where the chat box is? Hopefully you are. If you're not, it's that little bubble there that you can click on, and the messages will come up on the chat box where you can enter questions, comments, and also that's where the link that you will need to click on to fill out a brief survey with your name and what credits you'd like for at the end of the session. So please be looking at that chat box at the end of the session for that link. What's really important about that is that when you fill in that survey, that your name is the same name that you use to register. What's also important is, do you see how your name is coming up on the screen there? That name that's on the screen also matches the name that you registered with. That's very important to ensure that the credits go to who needs them and wants them, and that they go to the proper association that you're a part of. So if your name on the screen doesn't match the name you registered with, if you hover over your box where your name is, you're going to see a blue box pop up that has 3 dots on it. If you click on that, you're able to rename yourself. So that would be an easy way to make sure that your name on the Zoom matches the name that you registered with, which will also match the name that you use in that link that's going to be sent out in the chat box at the end of the session. So that's very important. So we appreciate you doing that. That helps us on our end to make sure that we're giving you what the continuing education credits that you're expecting. So please fill out that survey as soon as you get it, when you see it in the chat. That'll be at the end. So questions and comments. I mentioned that chat box, so you can see that little icon. Questions and comments, if you have them during the presentation, please write them in the chat. We're going to get to those at the end of the session. How it will work at the end of the session, I will read the questions out and the presenters will be able to answer them. So again, questions and comments, please put those in the chat box. Feel free to do that. Also at the end of the 4-part series, we're going to be giving out an evaluation. We want to see if there was more you wanted to learn, what you liked about it, so that we can improve or continue to do this great job for the next session. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you our speakers. Our speakers are Craig Highfield, Director of the Forest Programs with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and Ryan Davis. He's Forest Program Manager, also with the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay Forest Program. Craig Highfield is the Forest Program Director for the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay. The mission is to pursue innovative strategies and collaborations that improve the health of the region's forests, create new forests in places important to water quality, and promote the benefits of forest and resource management to private landowners, decision makers, and the general population of the six-state Bay watershed. Craig leads the forest team and is situated in the Alliance's state offices in Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Ryan Davis manages the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay's Forest Program out of the Pennsylvania office in Lancaster. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology and a minor in Forestry from North Carolina State University, and has a Master's of Science in Wildlife and Fisheries Biology from West Virginia University. He spent the first half of his career in the field traveling the country to chase critters, and the latter half creating habitat in Pennsylvania. Ryan now specializes in education and outreach on stewardship, helping landowners meet their habitat management goals on working lands and reforestation of agricultural and developed lands. So with that, I'm pleased to stop sharing my screen, and Craig and Ryan will share their screen and get us through the presentation. So again, please ensuring that you're putting your questions in that chat box, don't be shy, and that your name matches the registration. So I'm going to stop my screen here, Craig, and it'll be all yours.
Sounds great. All right. Well, again, my name is Craig Highfield. I'm with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and Brian and I will both be speaking to you today. So I'll take the first part of it, and Ryan will finish it up. So, okay. First of all, just to kind of get the basics, we are going to talk a little bit about ecology and kind of how to work within a forest or to create a new forest with that. So, what everyone knows is all plants need these three things to grow and to develop and to pass seed for the next generation: light, water, and nutrients. That's essential. In our forest setting in the East, light is the limiting factor. That's the thing, it's in the shortest supply within our forest setting. We have enough, our climate's enough where we have good soil moisture and soil nutrients. Light's the one that these plants are competing for. So when you kind of think about it, the tree Southern Red Oak, Quercus falcata, now grown in the open setting in our suburban areas, like the picture on the right, it's not competing with anything for light. So as it grows, its kind of main goal is to create a large crown. Because if it's creating a large crown, it's creating more leaves, more surface areas to produce food. Because when you think about a tree growing, it's got to do a lot of things. It's got to produce new tissues, new stems, new flowers, seeds, protection, sealing over wounds, trunk diameter, roots. There's a lot of things that's dedicated to the photosynthate that tree is producing. But without that competition, it can just grow out wider, producing more leaves. The more leaves it produces, the bigger the tree can get. Now, in a forest setting, that's quite different because the trees are in competition. It wants to produce that large crown, but it also has to elongate up. It has to grow upwards to try to get that crown above other trees. So they're in direct competition to do that. So that takes a lot of energy. So when you see a tree like this is a loblolly pine over on the lower eastern shore of Maryland. You walk in and you see a stem that big, you can only imagine how big that crown has to be in order to have grown a stem that large. Because the last thing a tree is going to allocate resource to is sort of a stem elongate or a stem widening. So diameter growth. So I know you guys talked about this last week. But I think forest ecology, and especially how it's demonstrated in old field succession, is essential to understand when trying to understand what's going on in a woodlot. So as you know, this is a competition for light. You know, in an abandoned field, the first thing you're going to have are those sun-loving, short-lived, fast-growing plants, the grasses and the forbs. They're annuals, they're not going to survive very long, but they're taking advantage of that light. Slowly growing up through that, you're going to have the shrubs, you're going to have blackberries and raspberries, kind of the woody shrubs that are growing as well. So they'll overtake the light from the grass and the weeds. But growing from that is you're going to start to get woody plants, you're going to start to get the trees. But these are going to be the fast-growing trees that are intolerant of the shade. And they're going to outcompete kind of that shrub stage that you had, those brambles that are out there. And then eventually, as you're starting to move towards climax, the winner of the light are those trees that might be growing slower, but they're more tolerant of that shade. It's all a competition for that light. So understanding where you are in succession and how to maneuver that light is going to help you understand what to be doing in the woodlot as far as management. So when you think about harvesting a forest, essentially, we're just moving in succession. Okay, when you harvest a forest, let's say it's a clear cut, you're actually moving that forest back to early successional stage. More sunlight is reaching the forest floor, and then you're going to have those grasses and forbs returning for that period. When you plant trees in an open field, you're essentially skipping forward in succession, because you're not waiting for the grasses and the forbs really to establish and then the brambles to come in. You're choosing what trees are going to be in your canopy, like in these plantings. That field on the right was a crop field 2 years ago that had been planted into a forest. And the field on the right was a pasture. So that's the idea, is you're moving succession forward. You're choosing to manage that. That is a manipulation of light, because eventually those trees are going to close their canopy and shade out those grasses. So I want to go through a couple slides to kind of show you this competition for light and how nature kind of handles that competition. So if you look at this forest, this is Allegheny National Forest, the Arnott Forest in Northwest PA, North Central Pennsylvania, up on the Appalachian Plateau. You can look at this forest in 2018, this picture. Seeing there, you have 2 mature black cherry trees and some sugar maples trees to the right. But it didn't always look like this. Back in 1928, you can see there had been a harvest that has gone through and kind of pushed that forest back to early succession. And you can see the vast amount of growth. Once that sunlight reaches the forest floor, you get a lot of growth. You know, within those next years, you could have thousands of trees per acre, all competing for those resources to grow, especially the light. I put 2 arrows on those 2 cherry trees. And we're going to kind of watch them in a series over the decades to see how they're competing with the rest of the forest. So you see here thousands of trees per acre. It's that competition for light. So 10 years later, you can see the forest is starting to thin out. The trees are starting to get bigger. You can look at the 2 cherry trees. The one on the left is actually starting to get a little bit bigger than the one on the right. So its crown is probably larger. It's making more food. So the next 10 years, you can start to see the tree on the left is expanding more. And then I want you to notice the tree that I have the blue arrow on. This is an aspen tree that's in the picture. It's growing, it's competing for that same light. And you can see the trees, the sugar maples there. If you know anything about sugar maples, they're tolerant of shade. They're very tolerant of shade. They grow very slow, but they can do well on the understory, just biding their time. Cherry trees are intolerant of shade. You can see that aspen there. Over the next decade, you can see it's vastly different. The cherry tree in the center there it's suffering. It's not growing very well because it's not able to expand its crown. You can see sugar maples are there in the understory. And then within that next decade, you look what happened with that aspen. And for some reason, it's dead. It's tumbled over there on the top, which allows more light to reach those trees. And you can see that one cherry tree has kind of responded. It's getting a little bit bigger where it was stunted over those last few decades. You can see it's getting bigger, so you can imagine its crown is also growing. Next, 2008, and then up to 2018. You can see it's almost caught the tree to the right. So you can imagine just that manipulation of light, the trees are responding to that. And so foresters, being the smart folks that they are, understand that. And there actually is a forestry practice called crop tree management. And it's a way of actually selecting trees that you want to grow to be up in the canopy. You're going to try to favor these trees to grow bigger. And they call it a crop tree because, and most of the time in forestry, they're thinking about the timber in the future. So you want to grow some of these high value trees as quickly as you can and as well as you can by allowing their crowns to expand to make more food. Now, in this guide, and the clients you're going to be working for, well, these are small acres. You know, the chances are they're not growing those trees to harvest later for some type of timber. And so Adam Downing actually coined this as something that kind of makes more sense on a small landscape, and that's chosen tree management. And it kind of makes more sense, I think, to clients, people who aren't used to growing trees for harvesting, is you're choosing a tree that's going to benefit you and your goals in some way. And you're going to kind of favor that to help that grow over the years. We generally use this chosen tree management on younger and kind of middle-aged woods. And we're going to kind of talk about that. And what you're trying to do with this is you're eliminating competition so you can accelerate the growth of the tree that you've chosen tree management. And this is kind of how it works. So in a forest, you have that vast competition of trees that are growing up. They're competing for that light. They're trying to expand their crowns. The idea with this is you're going to reduce the competition around the tree that you've chosen, so it can expand out, grow more leaves, produce more food, and be able to get wider. So it's kind of like weeding a garden. You have a lot of weeds in there. You want to clear them away from the things that you want to grow. But, you know, as a natural resource professional and working with clients, you could probably go back in their woods and pick several trees that you think would be a great tree to grow and grow better. But the idea is you have to tie these practices into the landowner's goals. And this chosen tree management can be used to enhance the growth of trees that are going to provide those goals. For instance, wildlife. If the landowner, if their interest is to increase wildlife on their property, you look for those trees that are going to provide those wildlife benefits. For instance, like a shagbark hickory. So maybe you have a smaller shagbark there that you want to grow up. A shagbark, a hickory, or hickories in general, they produce a hard mass. It's very valuable to wildlife. The bark on a shagbark, just like it sounds, kind of lofts off a little bit, which is great habitat for bats out there. So that might be a tree that you would want to favor in that forest to grow over the next many years. Aesthetics could be something that interests the landowner as well. Just having a lot of fall colors. I think of black gum, for instance, being a tree that we commonly find in our forest, which is beautiful in the autumn with its purple leaves. That might be a tree that you could choose to favor in order to grow a bigger crown and more beautiful leaves. Diversity is often a good one. A lot of times you might walk in a forest and you see your common species, but there might be a species that's different, that's maybe not found all over the forest. And you're trying to increase the diversity, let's say of a butternut. Maybe you found a butternut that you haven't seen before or hasn't been in that area. That could be something, a goal that a landowner might have. And the last one could be products. Could be something for firewood into the future. You want to kind of grow some of those trees that are going to be good for firewood. And so once you kind of have the goal or have worked with the landowner what their goals are, it helps you locate what tree you want to favor or you want to choose. The next thing to do is to figure out if kind of releasing that tree or releasing the competition around is going to be beneficial for that tree. So one thing you need to realize is that tree that you've chosen adapted to the site that you're on. Now, let's say, willow oak. That's a great tree. A lot of wildlife value in a willow oak with the acorns. It's in the red oak group. And it's a good tree. It grows very, very well in our riparian areas. Not saying it can't grow in the uplands, but if you happen to find a willow oak in the uplands and you favor that one, well, there's going to be other competition in there. It may not react or respond well to a release. So kind of understanding that tree that you've chosen, is it adapted to the site that you're on, is a good thing. Does that tree have desirable characteristics? Is it a nice long stem that it has so it can put up a crown? Or are there broken branches in the crown? Are there things that are going to inhibit its growth? Maybe there's two stems growing out of it. It's a kind of the V crotch or so that later on that it could be an issue. So looking for the characteristics of the tree into the future, that'll benefit. Generally, when you do a chosen tree management, you're looking for that live crown ratio. It's, the crown based on the rest of the size of the tree, and you're looking for at least 30% of the crown existing. And probably most importantly is, where is the tree right now in the canopy? So being able to look up as you're walking through these small woodlots is essential, because not all trees are going to respond to chosen tree management. And so here I have this figure here. Now, looking at these trees, these would all be trees that could potentially be canopy trees. Okay, so when you're looking at these small trees in this drawing, these are not like redbud, like understory trees or dogwood or hornbeam. These are trees that potentially could be in the canopy. But a lot of times these, say, the suppressed trees, they've lost the competition for light. Okay, they're relegated to the understory. Many of them probably won't make it in the understory. These won't be good trees to try to release. What you're trying to look for are dominant trees and co-dominant trees. So the dominant trees are the ones that already have their crowns way up in the forest, in the canopy. They're not really being competed with. But the idea is you want to make sure it's that way. So if your tree, your chosen tree happens to be dominant, you're just going to make sure it's able to stay in that dominant position and expand its crown. Because if it's expanding its crown, it's expanding its seed source, its leaves. Co-dominants are ones that, there may be other things interfering, like intermediate trees. So it's growing well up on the top, but on the sides, it's getting shaded in. So these are another ones that would respond fairly well to a chosen tree management. The intermediate trees, it's really dependent. So a lot of times you have to think, is it going to be worth it? So if it's an intermediate tree that is shade intolerant, it may not be worth it, like a tulip poplar or a black cherry, because if you release it, it might have been in that intermediate stage too long where it's not going to expand. It's just not going to have the genetics to do that. But if it's maybe an oak, it might respond. I would say probably going for dominant and co-dominant, maybe intermediate if it happens to be a slightly shade tolerant, maybe an oak or a maple. And then when you have your crop tree, you only need to remove the trees that are touching the crown of your crop tree or your chosen tree. If it's not interfering with the crown, it's not interfering with the crown expansion of that tree. So trees that are growing underneath, there's no need to remove them. They'll actually help, I think, the tree, the crop tree or the chosen tree as you continue. Because when you remove the trees around it, could be susceptible to wind, could be susceptible to epicormic sprouting on the stem. So as long as it's not interfering with the crown expansion, there's really no reason to remove it. And so here's just kind of a figure showing this. Here's a tree. It's a very crowded forest looking kind of from above there. And you see that chosen tree that you want, it's surrounded. Its crown is being touched by others. It can't grow outward anymore. The only way it can grow is up. So what you would do is just divide that tree kind of into a quadrant, and you're looking to remove either all trees or 3 quadrants of that. So in this one, you cut enough around that tree so it can now expand into that open space. And so here's an example, just some photographs. You see it's pretty close canopy on that. Doing some harvesting or cutting around that, you're trying to create more of an open canopy. Now those trees that are up there can not only expand up, they can also expand laterally. And there has real results with this as well. I mean, here's two examples. These are tree cookies showing what happens when a tree is released at that time. The tree on the left actually is a fir from out west. It's what I could find. But you can see in there's distinctive rings of the early growth of that tree. Very tight rings, meaning it wasn't adding wood quickly because it wasn't making enough food. As you start to clear the trees around it or release them, there's expansion from there. So the trees are going faster. They have a surplus of food that they can do kind of that lateral expansion of their stems. The trees on the right, you can see one was released and one wasn't. And you can see within a very short 26-year period how much growth there was on the tree on the left. Same species. And so here's an example. Here's a picture of, coming up to this area, often overcrowded forests. You can see all these trees, these red oaks, the scarlet oaks, they're growing all together. They're going very well, but they're all about the same size. When they're all competing like that, they actually all suffer because they're all under stress. They can only be so big. So the idea was, well, you pick the one that you want to keep. Which one has the potential to bring those benefits that you want. And so on this case, they chose the tree in the center, maybe had the straightest bole. Technically, you could have chosen 2 of those trees. You wouldn't have to cut them all. And then the rest of them, you're going to eliminate. And in this case, they girdle them. So they're cutting 1 inch into that tree all the way around in 2 different places. Usually it's about 6 inches apart. And those trees will die off. You just leave them there. Notice the small trees kind of in the center there to the left of the chosen tree. They didn't cut those. There was no reason to do it. It obviously wasn't interfering with the crown of those trees. Now, this is the point I do want to stop everyone, and I know you're going to cover this next week, but anytime you're allowing light to come down in the forest, things are going to happen. And so understanding before you do any action is very important. If not, you could say the woodland can suffer. And on this case, this is a forest, actually it was in Baltimore County where there was a thinning that happened. So they increased the light within that forest to help the trees grow better. But you can see surrounding that forest floor, what didn't happen before this thinning is now microstesium, or Japanese stilt grass, is now just invaded that entire area. Likely it was already there, and what happens when they thin that forest, it just exploded. It had enough of that sun that it just released. Same is true for that area on the right. This was a restoration project where Oriental bittersweet was removed, and it was going to be replanted, and you can see already there was an explosion of mile a minute. So it's an annual, the seed was already there. And so understanding what will happen before you release the light to the forest floor is very important. Maybe you do need to treat that area first before adding light. And then, so how are you going to do it? So how are you going to kill these trees? I know next week when you talk about invasive plants, you're probably going to cover these techniques, so I won't get into them, but just girdling of trees. You're cutting the vascular system of the trees. And this works really well for the ring porous trees like oaks and cherries and say hackberry, those that form those big vessels, early in that growing season. So girdling may be all it needs, in the winter or springtime for that tree to die. Other trees that are ring diffuse, where the large vessels are grown throughout the growing season, you might need herbicide. And so this is a very effective method for killing trees that I know Dave Jackson will get into, but it's called hack and squirt. Or you can just cut the trees down. So depending on the size of them, cutting them down and let them lay on the forest floor is another way to create that light or reduce that competition. And then leaving them up sometimes is a valuable resource. And this is kind of another wildlife activity that a service that you can provide on some of these smaller landscapes is a lot of our woodlands don't have dead trees. So, reducing competition in a chosen trees management, leaving some of those trees up to eventually be snags, or, it's a home for animals. It's excavated a lot of times by woodpeckers and a variety of birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles need snags in order to grow. If you think about woodpecker or American kestrel, chipmunks, whole variety of things kind of need this standing dead wood. Because a lot of times our forests are pretty young, or, some could be overmanaged, there's probably not a lot of dead trees in a lot of our forests. So creating snags or standing dead wood is a valuable wildlife resource you could do. And sometimes maybe the stuff that you're cutting isn't big enough. A snag's better when it's large. Technically 3 inches is a snag, a dead tree at 3 inches, but the larger it gets, the more animals that can use it is pretty important. Like pileated woodpeckers, just having standing dead trees as a perch. I mean, a lot of our raptors that use forests, or even the edges of forests, are looking for a dead tree to use as a perch, so it doesn't inhibit their view. But the trees that you lay down too, the logs, they're equally as invaluable for wildlife on the forest floor and for nutrient cycling back into the soil. Things like this chicken of the woods mushroom. that's growing out of this one, or the spotted salamander that you can find near vernal poles, but under dead wood. It stays moist under there, and that's what they need. So a lot of our amphibians need that. Okay, we were going to talk about tree ID, but I think I'm going to stop there and let Ryan go, just so we make sure we get his stuff in first. And if we do have time, we'll go back to that. So I'm going to stop sharing here.
Great, thanks, Craig. I am gonna start myself. Okay. So really great segue into the wildlife management component here. So very similar kind of philosophy is those kind of general resources that all animals need: food, cover, which we can break into escape cover from predators, thermal cover from inclement weather, and breeding cover, nesting substrate, brooding substrate, stuff like that. And so, some species are way more generalistic than others. There on the left, we have our lovely white-tailed deer, and they are generalists, pretty extreme generalists. They do not really require many specific habitat needs. And then kind of opposite there on the right, we have an indigo bunting, which does have very specific habitat that it needs. Very young forest with some standing kind of medium-sized trees to perch on or on the edge, and they really need that young forest habitat or they disappear from the entire landscape very quickly. For all of these habitat needs, they don't need them all at the same time at the same place. A lot of species will move around a lot over their annual cycle or during different seasons. And what we really need is all of these features to be available on their entire home range. So the entire area that they travel over a year period. And just like with thinking about the trees, what really we need to think about when thinking about managing for wildlife is those limiting factors. What is limiting on our landscape? So here we have Pennsylvania winter. I really like to focus on the winter because I think that is a time, for some reason, maybe it's just because people are outside a little bit less. I like to go outside more in the winter because there's less other people out there in the woods to bump into. But we can see here very, very far, even into the woods, you can see for hundreds of yards, there's not a lot of cover on this landscape and on most of our agricultural landscapes and developed landscapes in the mid-Atlantic. And so I think for some reason, and maybe it's just because we're Americans, when we're always just thinking about food, when people think about wildlife management, they want to think about creating food plots and that kind of stuff. Maybe, your oaks and your hickories for food, but they don't need more food per se on this landscape. There's actually pretty abundant resources there in those little woodlots with buds and acorns and potentially some other resources. But again, there is no cover out here at all. So really, what's likely the limiting factor for certain wildlife in this landscape would probably be cover, and typically that is the limiting feature on the landscape. But if you want to manage for wildlife in general and are not maybe concerned per se with, say, we're going to manage for turkeys, we're going to manage for, the spotted salamander. If you just want for wildlife, which I think is typically your average landowner's concern, is they just want more wildlife around. So really the key is just we want diversity, as much diversity as possible. We want as much diversity in those successional stages as possible. We want there to be grasslands. We want there to be shrublands. We want there to be kind of that pole timber sort of forest. We want there to be old forest. We want all of that stuff in the landscape nearby each other as much as possible. We want kind of a mosaic of habitat ages around the landscape. Here's an example. This is a state forest out in western Pennsylvania, with the exception of those areas that I drew around, and there's a couple other small little well pads as well. But this is just a even-aged forest, a huge, giant forest that's all the same age because it was all cleared, at the same time. And it all regenerated at the same time. If we didn't have these cuts in here, then we would be missing out on these younger forest patches that are providing immense resources for the species that need them. Those canopy gaps, like Craig said, make sure you do your preparation first. You're controlling your invasives before you put any light on the forest floor. But once you start to do that, and if you're doing your chosen tree release, you're actually going to be really invigorating the diversity of your understory. Getting good vertical diversity where we have saplings, we have seedlings, we have shrubs, we have herbaceous plants that are able to come in. Once we start to kind of puncture that even-aged canopy that we have in a lot of our kind of middle-aged forests, we can really start to do some good for our wildlife species by increasing the diversity. I'm really excited that there's a whole section on invasive plant management. I like to say that's really, not only is it the easiest thing we can do, because it doesn't require as much kind of technical acumen. If you can identify those plants and you can be safe with your management techniques with your herbicide or your mechanical removal, then you're ready to go. But it's also one of the most impactful things you can do for the forest health, but also for just a functioning ecosystem. So I kind of challenge you to next time you're out, find an invasive plant. I'm sure it won't take very hard, but go over and take a look at its leaf. And then compare that to a similar, an analog leaf. If you're looking at a bush honeysuckle or something, try to find a viburnum shrub or something like that, and just look at the difference in insect herbivory on those non-native plants compared to the native ones. Not only are invasive plants going to potentially dominate areas and inhibit regeneration and start to inhibit our future forest, but they're also, while they're doing that, they're not feeding insects at all. There is going to be very little insect damage on those non-native plants. They can't digest that tissue. And friendly reminder, insects are kind of the glue of our entire food web. They are the main forces that are turning plant material into animal material. And if we start to lose that capacity to eat plants, then we're going to lose a lot of wildlife species as well. Really, our whole ecosystem starts to unravel when it gets dominated by invasive plants. So if wildlife is your concern, if forest health is the concern of landowner, whatever you're going to do, the invasive plants are going to be a key part of that management regime. This addresses that, those limiting factors on the landscape. So winter cover is something that generally here in the mid-Atlantic is a little bit limiting in our modern landscape of pretty intensive agriculture, pretty intensive development, and then, our kind of middle-aged forests. So we can add these on the landscape, though. Luckily, we can plant a lot of dense shrubs. We can plant native grasses. If that isn't a possibility for a landowner, maybe they have a really small property or it's just not feasible, brush piles will do. Brush piles are great for creating some nice low cover in the woods, maybe as an intermediate step before some more light gets onto the forest floor. This picture here on the right, actually my dog is in it. My little beagle is in it. And she's even wearing I drew a little arrow to her so you can see her better, but she is not very far away. You could probably kind of see her now, but that cover is just so dense that it's going to be really warm in there. She's actually looking for pheasants. We flushed up some pheasants out of there that were able to hole up over winter. But additionally, it's perfect escape cover for predators. So that is where a lot of our larger species are going to be found in the winter, is in these shrub complexes, and we can add those to the landscape. Craig did a great job talking about snags, but I always like to share this photo. This is an Indiana bat, actually, federally endangered since the 70s. Actually, I think since the day the endangered species came out, this was on it. And it's not better yet, but you can even see it has a little tag there on its wing. But snags are just an essential resource, like Craig said. Bats are incredibly imperiled at the moment because of an invasive fungus that's ripping through their populations. And I've noticed a lot of landowners really, really care about bats and want to do their part. So creating snags while doing other forest management activities is a perfect way to check off a couple boxes at once. Even though food is often not the limiting resource, we want to make sure it doesn't become a limiting resource. So encouraging the mast-producing species is a great idea. And so like Craig said, what I like to do, my philosophy, instead of trying to add those in, is assessing if they're in a stand already. And if they are, then yeah, we just want to encourage them. We want to give them a little bit more light, give them a bit more space, clear out some invasives around them, stuff like that. So we have soft mast is those, drupes, berries, things like that, fleshy fruit, and then hard mast is our acorns, our hickory nuts, our beech nuts, things like that. So now kind of pivoting a little bit away from just the wildlife management, habitat management, But this is still a habitat management practice, but into the lawn conversion component, or really just open land component. What I really encourage people to do is to think critically and clear-eyed about how they're using their property. What exactly are they doing with every square foot of that land, and is it giving back as much as they're putting into it? So obviously lawns do have some utility. Areas where there's a lot of foot traffic, areas where maybe you have to park a trailer back there every once in a while. You're having some cover year round can be helpful. A good place to play catch with the kids or the grandkids or the dog or whatever. Lawns have some utility, but I doubt that that Pennsylvania is about 7% lawn cover right now. I doubt that is all being used for good reasons. I think we generally just keep it around as the default option, but I think we need to think about that. They're ecologically sterile, even though they can have some use, but they require a lot of inputs. Even just mowing every other week or so is actually pretty labor intensive when then we consider the alternative of managing a forest, which has very, very low maintenance costs and inputs, but we're not getting any ecological functions out of this as well. And I like to, while we're thinking about what are we putting in, what are we getting out, those ecological functions should be part of that consideration of what we're getting out. A lawn is going to create more stormwater runoff. It's not going to sequester any carbon. It's not going to clean our air for us. It's not really going to do much at all, but a forest can do all of those things. And so if we're not using an area of lawn, we can change that. Additionally, marginal cropland is another area that I really think we need to think about. Obviously we need to eat, obviously we need farmlands, but I don't think we need to farm, every square foot that we currently farm. A lot of y'all who are on the call are probably older than me and probably remember farms being a lot messier than they currently are. Even when I was a kid, I remember fallow fields, I remember hedgerows, and we don't really have that anymore. A lot of farmland used to be habitat for a lot of species that did well around farms, like pheasants and quail. But now we don't really have those around because we don't really have habitat on our farms anymore. But again, it doesn't have to be that way. We can change that. And we can change it in ways that are creating other ecological benefits, like, for example, reforesting the stream that's going right through here. Getting those cows out of the stream is going to improve their health immensely. It's going to improve the operation here. And it's also going to add some habitat onto this landscape that's otherwise completely denuded. I mean, we can see literally for miles in this picture, and there's potentially one or two native plants, that we can see. Pretty scary. So what are our alternatives to lawn, to monocultures in general? We can go either way, but really it's just kind of splitting hairs. We can go either very young forest, or meadow, or grassland, or forest, like Craig said, kind of skip that meadow part and go right into planting the trees. Whichever way you do, you're going to be saving a lot of money. You're going to really be increasing the ecological benefits of that property, providing a lot of habitat. And honestly, it sounds cheesy, but it is a lot of fun to be able to enjoy as it's growing, and then also once the habitat is in place. So I'm going to very quickly run through how you do this. There are a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of technical expertise, and there's a lot of programs to help with the technical assistance as well. But very briefly, the first thing you have to do if you're going to convert a lawn area is kill that existing vegetation. Luckily, lawn grasses are super easy to kill. If it is currently being mowed, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever, it's actually the easiest to restore into native habitat. If they've let it grow up all summer, that's a completely different talk, and that takes a lot more time. So we won't cover that today. But if it is a lawn, typically it just takes 2 herbicide applications, sometimes even 1 will do the trick. If you're going to do a fall seeding, then I recommend spraying around mid-September, and then coming back mid-October, assessing, and then spraying the regrowth that you do see. You don't have to spray the entire site at that point. You can spot spray. And then you can seed it a couple weeks after that last spray with your typical broadly selective herbicide. There is several organic options if people don't want to use herbicide, but I really recommend using herbicide. It's the most efficient and effective thing for this kind of purpose. You're not going to be able to necessarily change people's minds if they're really set on not using the chemicals, but all the negative impacts of the chemicals are mostly because we take areas that are vegetatively diverse and we're using that chemical to remove all of that vegetative diversity. In this case, where we're using it to kill the lawn so that we can restore a natural, grassland, we're doing the opposite. So really the environmental impacts there are going to be a lot less. Same with invasive plant management. A lot of landowners don't want to use herbicide on invasive plants, but it's the best thing that you can do for your woods and for your habitat. You are by spraying those invasives, you are increasing your diversity likely over time. So I recommend going the chemical approach. Next step, if you have a large area, over an acre really, then using a seed drill is recommended. But if you have less than an acre, just broadcast seeding, doing it by hand is quite effective and actually a little bit logistically easier on these smaller areas. But before you're going to spread the seed, you have to make sure that seed bed is clear. So you can rake that, you can use machinery to rake it, but you want to make sure it's nice and clear and prepared. Then the seeding itself, with the seed mixes, there's a lot of resources out there as well, but I want to just make sure it's all native to exactly where you're planting. Try to buy from as local of a seed company as you can. There is a really great one here in PA and some other good ones kind of nearby as well. Make sure that the mix has a lot of diversity, a lot of perennials, and actually a lot of native grasses as well. We don't want to go for all wildflowers because those grasses are doing a lot of functions for us in the grass stand. If you're using if you're spreading over a large area or a steep slope, then I would consider using a cover crop just to slow or prevent erosion. And then I really recommend using a filler if you're going to be spreading by hand, because that seed is so light and fluffy, and you will spread it very, very fast if you don't use a filler to help it carry as you're spreading it, but also to help it go further. So you can use kitty litter, sand, potting soil, anything to just help you spread that a little bit further. A little bit of the mechanics of that, I recommend mixing it all up, breaking it into 2 batches, and then spreading, up and down one way, half, and then taking your other half and spreading perpendicular to that way so that you get more even coverage. Obviously, if you have access to a turf roller, that's a great way to make sure you have good soil to seed contact. But if you don't, you could just drive a 4-wheeler over it or a truck, or just walk over it a bunch of times, have a bunch of kids line up and have them walk back and forth over it. Whatever you do, you're going to be squishing the seed into the soil a little bit, and just that tiny little bit of contact is enough for these plants to be able to germinate well. On that note, these grassland species evolved in our native prairies and our native savannas, so they are used to systems that are either burning frequently, so a fire would rip through and then there would be a very open habitat where there's nothing else existing, and then the seed bank explodes, everything starts to germinate, and they spend all of their energy putting in really, really big roots. There's not going to be a lot of growth of what we seed during the first year, typically, for any of our perennial species. If you put in a bunch of annuals like black-eyed Susans, partridge pea, they will start to spring up at first thing, which is great. But other than those species, if there's anything that's over 12 inches tall or so, it is very, very unlikely that it's something that we seeded. So this is a little counterintuitive, but for the first growing season, you actually want to mow. But you don't want to mow down to the ground. You want to mow to about 8 inches off the ground, no lower than 6 inches. But I like to give a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of a buffer, and say 8 inches. That's because the meristematic tissue, the stem cell tissue essentially of these herbaceous plants, is around 6 to 8 inches off of the ground. So if you mow lower than that, you're going to be discouraging your foxtail and stuff like that crept in there that you want to be discouraging right now. But you're also going to be potentially ripping up the natives that you spent a lot of money to put in there as seed. So every time you get above 12 inches, brush hogging it down to about 8 inches is enough to make sure that any of those annuals that are creeping in, all of those weedy species, are not going to be reseeding themselves in our patch here. And then year 2, if you've done a good job keeping those things out, we will get very dense coverage, and just a total explosion above ground of a lot of flowers, a lot of grass species. And then by the third year, it will start to reach a little bit more of a mature status, and it'll be kind of fully what it will likely be for the next 10 years or so, or potentially longer, depending on how you manage it. So on that note, the maintenance and the management, there's kind of two situations that are going to arise that are why you're going to need to manage this meadow. The first is kind of a nice thing, actually. It'll proceed through natural succession. So that species there on the left, that black locust, that is the king of natural succession. It'll pop in, it'll find any open spot, and it'll start growing very, very quickly. And that's great. If you want it to turn into a forest, I do think that's a fantastic way to go about things. But if the landowner wants it to stay a meadow, for the foreseeable future, then making sure those woodies are not taking over is going to be an important part of the maintenance. Then there on the right, we have another picture of a complete disaster of a mile a minute, mirroring Craig's. That is the major concern that I would have, more so than native woodies creeping in is invasive plants creeping in, and fastidiously managing against them is going to be a really important part of the meadow management. So I recommend inspecting the meadow maybe way more than annually, actually, as much as you possibly have time for. And then as soon as they're detected, when it's biologically feasible to do so, remove them or treat them. Again, we kind of want that meadow to change composition over time if you're letting it turn into a forest. But if you want to set back those woody plants, brush hogging it again, no lower than 8-ish inches off the ground is really important. So what I recommend doing, because if you mow the entire thing at once, you're going to be removing all the habitat, for that season. I recommend not mowing in the fall, but mowing in the spring, early spring, before our natives start to break dormancy. Early April, we'll do it up here in PA. If you're down in Virginia, especially Southern Virginia, it might be, a lot earlier into March. But before our natives start to green up, if you mow it then you're going to be chipping up all that woody growth that's coming in, whether those are invasives or natives, so we don't have to worry about those. And you're going to be actually kind of clearing the thatch a little bit, which does help the growth of our grassland stand. And then you really don't want to mow during the summer to protect breeding songbirds and actually a lot of insects that lay their eggs in this plant tissue as well. So something that I kind of recommend doing is maybe the landowner doesn't have room to do, half an acre, but they have a little bit of lawn or a patch that doesn't really get used. And this is my little yard in Lancaster City, my tiny little row house yard. And so I recommend doing what's called a pocket meadow. So you could buy a couple of plugs of native plants. I did mine partly with seed, partly with plugs, and just try to do it on a small area. Get a feel for it, see how it is, see how you like it. Get your feet wet before you go ahead and start to do this on a larger area. Now, I did want to be fair. So this picture here on the right was from last year, and that was the first year. This is the update from this year. So it's pretty nuts looking, and that is partially because I chose species that got really tall and got really crazy. And I did crazy stuff like I dug up goldenrod from old fields and put it in my backyard. And this is what happens if you do that. But it doesn't have to look like this. But I will say that I love it. It's fantastic. It is just buzzing from late May through October with insects. It's really, really fantastic, and it has really been a light on my life and my wife's life here, especially now when we're almost always at home. Okay, so reforestation is technically a little bit easier if you have someone who knows what species to choose, how to lay it out, how to plant it, how to maintain it. It's actually kind of a little bit easier. It's a little bit more familiar for people to plant trees. Obviously, trees are fantastic for pollinators, for insects, for wildlife, for basically any objectives that you have for improving your environment. But they are critical near streams. They're excellent everywhere, but utterly essential near streams. If we want water to be of any decent quality, we need to reforest our stream sides as much as possible. And then a nice little benefit of trees is that they very quickly reduce their maintenance requirements by just shading out the understory. So once they get established, there's very little work to do here. Whereas something like a meadow would require, perennial care, even though it's not much compared to a lawn. So for considerations, again, we want as much diversity as possible while we're at it. Some things I like to encourage folks to do is not just want to choose trees that are going to do well there, or to try to jump ahead to that, climax forest of all oaks, but mix in some pioneer species, some slower growing species. Make sure you have overlapping blooming periods so that from April all the way through, September-ish, something is blooming. We can do that. We have trees that do that. So all we have to do is be a little bit smarter, and we're really cranking up the environmental benefits of the tree planting area. And then, we're going to talk about this, but maintenance is critical. Mowing between these trees is really, really important at first, but then we want you to stop mowing. Because that's going to increase the benefits as well. And if you're constantly in there with a mower, you're just going to compact the soil. You're going to potentially damage roots. It's not going to be ideal. But we do want you to mow for the first couple of years, or else the trees are going to struggle to establish, which we'll get into. A lot of people don't really like these tree shelters, but they are necessary. They're completely necessary. There's a bunch of different kinds out there. We really recommend 5-foot tall tubes. They've really come a long way in the last decade or so. Now they're perforated on the side, they're vented. There's a bunch of other bells and whistles on them. But what these do, they're protecting from deer. They're also what allow us to find the trees to do this maintenance and this management. We need to avoid, obviously damage by deer, rabbit, squirrels, that kind of stuff that would be browsing. But then our subterranean critters, our voles, our gophers sometimes, but the major problem is the voles. If we do not manage around these trees, the voles will be managing their habitat, their grassland habitat, by killing the trees. They do not want it to proceed through succession because they like to eat the grass roots. So if it turns into a forest, there won't be any more grass for them to eat. So they get in there, they stay nice and warm all winter in our shelters, and then they'll girdle our trees. And we want to avoid that. So we want to manage for a lack of vegetation around each tree. You can do that a couple different ways. Some people will just scour with a weed whacker. That's one way to do it. Again, herbicide is a very efficient, effective tool. I don't know, the environmental benefits of running a 2-cycle engine for an entire 8-hour period compared to just, spraying really quickly. But if people want to do it that way, you can just scour. Also, there are some options. You could do black plastic mats. Also, increasingly, we're messing around up here in Pennsylvania with stone mulch that has a stone dust with it, as well as just basically a physical barrier to prevent those rodents from getting down into the tubes. And that seems to work pretty well. And then mowing as well is really important, because it's reducing the vegetative competition to these trees, but also it's reducing the cover for those rodents so that they're not going to go out into the open to get our trees. But then again, after the first 3-5 years, somewhere in there, once the trees are well established, you can go ahead and stop mowing. Just manage your invasives. So this is what a riparian forest buffer planting can look like 10 years in with good maintenance. Beautiful, gorgeous. This is well on its way to becoming a forest. And this is this is a riparian forest buffer planting in Virginia. A pretty nice results from that effective maintenance. But this is mostly what you see if you go to a riparian forest buffer planting site 10 years later. Is very few trees. There are a couple bush honeysuckles and maybe an autumn olive popping up in here, but that's not a riparian forest. But we still have superb habitat for the meadow vole here. Tons of grass for them to eat, nothing shading their habitat out, no perches for hawks or owls. This is what they want. And they got in there because I'm sure it was never mowed, it was never sprayed, the maintenance wasn't done, and so it didn't become a forest. I am not in the business of planting trees, I'm in the business of establishing forests, so we have to do that maintenance. Okay, and so this is what the habitat could look like in just 4 years. This is a planting in Maryland. I believe it's in Carroll County, Maryland. I get my lines kind of blurred when I cross the border, but this is only 4 years of growth, and you can see my hat there for scale. This is crazy fast growth here, but and then what we're shooting for just a couple years later, this is a different site, but this is what we're shooting for. It is only 7 years old as we start to close that canopy. And even if someone was obsessed with tidiness and wanting things to be, very well kept underneath these trees, there is no mowing to do. The shade is taking care of that. It is starting to turn into a forest. which is fantastic. That's what we want. That's what we're shooting for. So where do you procure your native plants? I'm sure you're already familiar with this, but you're going to want to avoid big box stores, conventional nurseries. Sometimes they will have native plants, but they'll be weird cultivars. What you really want to do is look up native plant nurseries, partially because that's where you're going to get good stock, but also we need to support those because we need more native plants to do these projects. So the more we're purchasing from them, the better they'll be able to supply us in the future. So all you have to do is plug it in your favorite search engine, look up native plant nurseries near you. I do recommend doing your research before you go out there and start to buy stuff. Make sure they know what they're talking about and make sure they have a good selection that you need. Again, I'll just hit it again. We have to reforest our stream sides. If there's a stream on a property and it does not have a forest around it, that really needs to be a high prerogative, high on the objective list. For something to do, because we're not going to have clean water if we don't have forests around our streams. And it's excellent habitat for pollinators, for wildlife. Riparian forests are the best, hands down. So all we have to do is find the right landowners who have the streams, who are willing to reforest them. And then with kind of both of these options, all of these options, I like to remind people that it doesn't have to be kind of one or the other. They're not mutually exclusive. This is kind of funny. We have that blue vervain, that verbena coming out of the tree shelter here with a silver maple. Obviously, it wasn't planted in there, but we could couple these things. You could couple reforestation with grassland establishment. You could do half in grassland, half in forest. You could do both. You could do all of it. But no matter what you do, if you're adding native plants to the landscape, you're doing a good thing. So start small and let it grow from there. If you are interested in all of these assistance programs I've been talking about, especially with reforestation, with planting trees, there are resources. There's abundant resources everywhere to get that done. No matter where you are, we can help you find funding to make that happen, and potentially technical assistance as well. So if you're in Maryland or actually anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon, give Craig an email. We actually got to plant, we had to plant next to each other a couple times a year. And then if you're north of the Mason-Dixon, we'll say PA or New York. I don't know if New York was part of this series, but then you can contact me and we'll either have funding ready to go actually for you, or we can connect you to the right people to make that happen. So yeah, we were going to touch on tree identification, but we're already probably way behind time. We didn't feel we could jam this in, but just a couple weeks ago, I was actually on another webinar series that was recorded and is now on YouTube. So you can look this up on YouTube. Just type in identify trees during any season, and I should actually be the first result on that. Lancaster Conservancy was the partner who hosted that, and it's roughly an hour long of me teaching you how to use tree identification keys, how to do tree ID any time of the year. On that note, if you want to just kind of keep learning, keep kind of gaining not just identification acumen, but some of the natural history as well, we also have a little YouTube series called Tree Talk. So if you just look for Forest for the Bay on YouTube, that's our forest education arm of the Alliance. Then you'll find our little show, and feel free to subscribe. And we put one out about once a month, and people seem to like them. We're trying to just kind of cover as much vegetative diversity as possible, obviously focusing on trees, but we put a little herbaceous stuff in there sometimes from time to time. So I just this morning published our Halloween special this year, and we did it on bloodroot. So that was a lot of fun. And then kind of some more on that note, if you want to follow along, you want to learn more about forest stewardship, forest management, we're your guys, we're your people. So if you go to forestforthebay.org, we have structured that to be basically a clearinghouse of forest management information and resources, and that could be a really great place for either you to start or for landowners that you're working with to start to learn more, to get into it, and to get engaged. And if you're interested in signing up for our newsletter, little arrow there, I have an incentive for you. If you subscribe by tomorrow, you'll be in the list in enough time to get our special Halloween newsletter. It's the 4th year we've put it out. We call it Forest for the Bats. And it's kind of a spooktacular, all kind of spooky themed articles and videos and things like that. But okay, so I'm sure I've gone over. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen, and we'll keep the show going here. Thanks.
So thank you, Craig, and thank you, Ryan. That was very informative. It looks like we have some questions in the chat. There was some great pictures in there. I like that winter picture, getting us geared up for the next few weeks. So the first question that came up was when Craig was talking about that chosen tree. What is the recommended live crown ratio for releasing a pine?
That's an excellent question. I don't know that. A lot of the stuff I was talking about was for hardwoods, but yeah, for live crown ratio, I don't know it on a pine.
Okay, great. Thanks for letting us know that you were talking about hardwoods there.
Well, I mean, you could still release pines and conifers, that is, but as far as live crown ratio, the 30% is for hardwoods.
Okay, so 30% for hardwoods. Okay, great. And I was just following along in the manual while y'all were talking. You did a great job with getting as much information as you can from pages, it was about page 17 to about little past page 29 there. So great job there, you guys. The next question is there a guide to how many snags would be ideal per acre? That answer is on page 31 of the manual. I was following along a little bit.
What is it, Agnes?
It says 5 to 7 snags and at least 6 inches in diameter. So that was on page 31, y'all, okay, in the manual there.
Yeah, and I would add to that, though, I mean, you're looking at different sizes as well. So, for it to start to be useful for wildlife, I mean, you're thinking 12 inches. So you might have 3 that are 12 inches, but, getting bigger as well. So it's not just a one set number, but you want various sizes and in various locations within that acre as well.
Great. So then I'm just scrolling through. People were having lots of great conversations and making really good statements. Somebody here was asking about invasive ivy on the slope of their yard. They tend to pull it and it grows faster than they can eliminate it. I don't know what to plant in that area to squeeze it out. Do you have any ideas to offer? So what can this person plant in that area to kind of squeeze out that invasive ivy? Any suggestions?
I mean, putting any kind of tree would obviously put the shade on that. So, but I mean, if you're looking to keep it low, any kind of shrub, I guess it would depend on the site conditions of that, but there's a variety of native shrubs that would do well and spread out.
Great.
Yeah, I'll second that, especially if it's English ivy and it's growing in the shade. Shade can be super hard to get kind of a native ground cover in. So that's why people plant English ivy. But I second that. You could find a lot of shrubs that are kind of low, or you want taller shrubs, shade tolerant shrubs, and that would be great too. But yeah, spice bush, a lot of viburnums would be great in there, like a black haw or arrowwood. Fantastic for pollinators, great for wildlife, pretty fall foliage, and they'd smother all the invasives too.
Great. Another question also about invasives. How do you control invasives before opening the canopy? They're kind of questioning Japanese stiltgrass. Hey, good luck with that one. And mugwort. So I love this question. How do you control invasives before opening the canopy? Is there any suggestions on that?
Well, I mean, one thing is identifying what invasive it is and how rampant it is. I mean, you could probably assume there's a lot in the soil that's not going to emerge until the canopy's open. So, I mean, I think doing your best and recognizing early on what it is. So, things like microstesium, I mean, that's an annual. Its seed could be in the soil for 5 years. It could survive. So, I mean, if you're treating that early, just knowing that microstesium's there, when you do open it, just making sure you understand that could be an issue and addressing that early. So I would say try to discover what plants are in the area and what might already be in sight, and then learn kind of the phenology of that plant, how it grows, how it reproduces. but just being aware that it could emerge, I think is essential. That one site that I did show, it was, they weren't sure if it was brought in with the equipment or what, but I mean, it was, they did nothing for it. And it was an entire season. It's just carpeted the understory.
Good point. Interesting reminder of monitoring and that the importance of monitoring and maintenance. I think that's great. You know, you can even write a journal or something to help you kind of keep track of that phenology. Somebody also was asking about control. Now, I know we're going to talk a little bit about more of control of invasives next week. So maybe if you want to touch on, somebody's asking about brambles. How would we control them?
I guess it would depend on the species. What kind of brambles are we talking?
That wasn't specified, but I think that's a great question for next week's.
Yeah.
So there was also another question: when we're converting that area to a meadow, if the lawn is a majority of weeds, do we still need to get rid of everything to bare surface before the seeding?
Yeah. So there are some plants like clover that we consider to be, you know, super innocuous, and it's just a cute little nice, everybody loves clover, but clover is going to choke out the stuff that we seed. So yeah, unfortunately you do, even if it isn't just a monoculture of grasses, if there are some other little things in there, yeah, you're going to have to kill it all. And honestly, some of those little guys might actually become issues, and that's what you're managing against when you're doing that establishment mowing.
Great. And Ryan, while you were talking about the seeding, people put in the chat box some places to get seeds and plants in their area. So I appreciate y'all sharing that knowledge. This next question here is, so 2 acres of primarily milkweed and no diversity. Will other plants compete successfully, or do I need to remove some of the milkweed? There is a pretty thick thatchet.
I would recommend, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, what do you recommend?
Yeah, I would recommend trying to get some more diversity in there, because even though milkweed is great, and I'm assuming it's probably common milkweed, it's not the best. As far as herbaceous plants go, I mean, the monarch is one of a small list of insects that can eat that plant tissue. So by adding some more stuff into there, we're actually going to do ourselves a big favor. But we do want to keep that milkweed component. But you know, interseeding can sometimes work, but once the habitat is kind of established, then it might be time to potentially get some pretty vigorous plugs and put those in there. But you can kind of chip away at it. You don't have to try to do the entire place at once. You can add a little bit of something else, maybe something that's blooming later, since I kind of gave away what I was thinking about, adding some goldenrod in there. But because the milkweed is blooming so early, then nothing else is going to be blooming. So if we add in, you know, goldenrod, monarda, stuff like that, that's pretty tough, that's going to be able to hold its own against the sea of milkweed, then you're going to be enhancing the habitat for sure.
Sounds like a lot about knowing what we're going to grow, that knowing about that phenology. I just want to comment those hot pockets. If you want to know about those hot pockets, AKA voles, there's a link for an extension publication there if you want to find out more. This next question is coming up about trees per acre. How many trees per acre to start with? So if you look on page 21 of the manual, that's giving us some guidance about spacing and stuff. So what do you all recommend on how many trees per acre to start with? And any arrangement, is any arrangement okay to keep it more natural and less plantation looking like?
That's a great question. And Ryan, I probably could give 2 different answers on that. It depends. So we plant a lot of bare root seedlings. And so we'll plant anywhere from 300 to 440 per acre. So that's a 10-foot spacing or a 12-foot spacing. You know, I've heard people go on 15-foot spacings on some of the bare roots. We generally try to plant them in rows just to make the ease of mowing and maintenance on it. I mean, I do understand the natural, people want it to look natural and not like, you know, a plantation, but over the next 10 years, you're going to have enough die off where it might shake up the look a little bit, the appearance. I have known sometimes we'll plant in rows, but we'll change the spacing a little bit, maybe do 15 here and 8 here just to kind of give it that. But as long as they're in rows, I think it's really important to keep it in rows for maintenance. Just you don't want to make it a pain to do. Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll second that. And there's ways you can get a little creative to still have them in rows so that you can mow, but it's not going to look like, Arlington Cemetery with all these crazy straight lines. You can follow contours, especially with the stream, with the slopes. You can do some things and make it look and stagger the rows. But yeah, you pretty much have to do the rows if you want survival. But yeah, up here, every state is different. In Pennsylvania, the minimum to qualify for reforestation is 200 stems per acre. I usually shoot for around 300, just because that gives us so much more wiggle room and we get canopy closure a lot faster. So in general, the more trees, the better. I'd rather it be an issue of having to thin later than not having enough trees from the jump.
Great. When do land care practices for woodland health and doing girdling or hack and squirt and leaving trees standing as snags, should the contractor be concerned with liability if the tree falls on the landowner or another person using the property?
No, boy, that's a great question that I'm sure I can't legally say anything, but I mean, it's a great point. If you're creating standing dead wood, it's standing dead wood. So I think the main thing there, if you're creating snags or you're releasing tree, you just need to make sure it's not in an area near a trail or something like that. So that you just have to consider where people are going to be. And, the understanding that tree, is dead. It could fall anytime. It may be 10, 15 years before it does, but it could be, in a week or so. Who knows?
And, that's a good conversation to have with the landowner too, about that, using that process. So somebody asked, is there a way to get a copy? How do I get access of the manual? So this is the manual that y'all would have gotten when you registered for the class, and you would have gotten a Virginia tree ID book and a Virginia shrubs and vines. Okay, so those will help you get to know some of the native plants and shrubs to kind of plant in those areas that you're going to recommend to landowners. Okay, going through, people are giving suggestions about some things to plant in place and how to use them. So talking about herbicides next week. And I think shortly the link to the survey to get credits is going to be coming in, just for y'all to keep your heads up. I love all these comments, and sorry I'm buzzing through them, but I'm taking note of the time. Okay, here is another question. What is your experience with plug survivors versus bare root stock survivability? What is your experience between plug survivability and root stock survivability?
So in trees, like the bare root versus like container seedlings, we only plant, I shouldn't say that. We plant a lot of bare roots in the spring. That's just because we can get them from the state nurseries. They're very inexpensive. We can, plant a lot of acres. And for me, a lot of people have, bad perceptions of bare root seedlings, but I think that has to do with maintenance. I think if you're using bare root seedlings and you're maintaining the site, we're doing our survival rates right now, and we're getting 90-95% survival on a lot of these plantings. That's 400 trees per acre. And it all has to do with maintenance. Is make sure there's that routine maintenance that you're doing throughout the growing season for the first few growing seasons. So I like bare root. They're harder to get in the fall. You can still get them. So we've done some fall plantings where we use containerized seedlings. They're a lot more expensive. You can't plant as much, but they do well. Great.
So Tasha says that they have 5 acres of woodland. Their 5 acres of woodland was cut before they purchased the property, and is not manageable to walk through. Any advice? So On page 36 and 37, Jonathan Kays, one of the Woodland Woods in Your Backyard partnership contributors, build the trail and tell the tale. That's what he would like to say right now. So page 36 and 37 talks about building a trail and how that's done. Do you have any advice on making it more walkable, or do you want to add to that?
Ryan, do you have, I say just make it interesting, but I mean, it's going to require you to clear areas out, clear paths, and kind of maintain those paths. But
Great.
Yeah, I'd second that. That's your first step, and then starting to chip away from there at your invasives, and then it might be the case that it's good regeneration. I kind of doubt it between deer, invasives, high grading, all of that. It's probably a bunch of invasives, but yeah. So I would start with trail and kind of array out from there.
Yeah, and I would say make it interesting too. So maybe survey what's on your land first before deciding where the trail is going to go, because you want it to go by interesting parts of your property and safe places too. So.
Yes. So the link to get your continuing education credits will be going up in the chat. So if you want to get continuing education credits, please keep your eye out in the chat. Click on that link that's going to be provided there. You can see that there, Andrew Kling sent me a direct message, and he's going to send that to everybody shortly. And you're going to see that it says PennStateQualtrics.com. So Andrew will send that to everybody in just a second here. So when you see that link come up, please click on that, and your survey will be there to get your continuing education credits. So I thank you, Andrew. And I think that may be it for our questions. So our next one in our series of 4, our third webinar coming up next Thursday is Land Care Practices for Woodland Health Continued. So that's November 5th and November 7th. So there's that link, y'all, to click on if you want to get continuing education credits. Please click on whether you want SAF. If you see that your association is not on that list, click the Get Certificate. And then you can, when that certificate arrives to you, you can send that to where you want to get your continuing education credits. Please do click on that link in the chat box. If you're having a difficulty finding that link in the chat box, let us know. Yes, there was a link sent out in the first session. And a good reminder that don't forget to fall back this week. So in closing, Ryan and Craig, thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate you working with the Woods in Your Backyard partnership. And we look forward to getting in touch with you. I think one of the things that I wish we had more time to talk about is when you mentioned funding for landowners. One of my questions is, what's the minimum size a landowner? Like, is it 5 acres, 2 acres, 10, 20? What's the minimum size where any landowner can get in touch with you all to help get some funding?
Really, anyone. I mean, yeah, any size is fine. I mean, we like our reforestation programs in Maryland, we're looking to plant at least an acre. We look for funding to do that, but all the way up to, large acreages as well. But there's various programs. If we don't have a program, we want to try to connect people to funding out there as well. So
you are the go-to people. So if I am a green industry professional and I am talking to a landowner that wants to do some of these practices, I can encourage that landowner to contact you guys to maybe help out with some funding.
Yeah, definitely the reforestation stuff. There seems to be more money available for that. As far as work though, in the woods, yeah, we don't have funding necessary for that in wood stuff, but there are cost share programs if it's large enough acres.
Somebody asked about the link for next week's session. The link for next week's session to join in on the webinar remains the same. So you can, how you got here tonight, well, how you're going to get here next week. So please don't lose that link. Again, I hope you all have clicked the link in the chat box if you want to get your continuing education credits. I see that it's almost 8:30. Hey, good timing, you guys. Great job. There was a lot of compliments and a lot of conversation in there that I went over, you guys, and I'm sorry I missed that, but I wanted to make sure that we were ending on time. So thank you all for joining us. Craig and Ryan, thank you again. And I appreciate the participants out there joining us today. Thank you for your conversation in the chat. And an email reminder will be sent out next week for the webinar and how to log in. So don't worry. You probably have Andrew and mine's email. If you have any questions, we'll do our best to answer them. So take care, y'all. Have a good night, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.
Take care. Thank you.